to bring a message to look, listen and respect the custodians of the land. And we'd also like you to join in, if you'd like to acknowledge Turrubo. Washing your left arm and your right arm. Kangaroo.
An introduction to a well-recognised local would be redundant, so I herald the welcome of the Honourable Kevin Rudd MP, the Federal Member for Griffith, with these few words. Kevin has a distinguished career from bureaucrat to diplomat, from MP to PM. With all that he achieves in national and international spheres, it is the apology for the injustice, discrimination and hurt to the stolen generations of Australia's First Peoples, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, given on behalf of all Australians, all Australia's multicultural people, that eclipses his other achievements, I think. On the 13th of February 2008, with that statement of truth, at last, Australia began to recognise and remove the insidious barriers to reconciliation. Welcome, Kevin Rudd.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me back there. I hope you can hear me over there and hear me behind. I'm surprised there's no one to my right as well. This is like theatre in the round. Oh, there are many people to my right, let me tell you that. I've had an interesting week. I've had 3 major achievements this week. The first is I publicly declared my support for same-sex marriage. So much so that this morning at my electoral office up here in Morningside, friends from the gay community painted a rainbow crossing on the pavement outside my office, which is right next to the state LNP member's office. And so I've let him wrestle with that all day as to whether it was for him or whether it was for me. It's been gratifying though in and around the country this week to speak to the parents, the mothers and the fathers of children who are gay. And it's been quite extraordinary to hear their personal stories about the anxiety, the distress, the suicidal possibilities of young gay men and women in Australia for whom the politics and the reality of social exclusion has been at times breaking of the soul. And I think it's time we made some progress. The second big thing to happen to me this week was I got my first tattoo. I hope it's not indelible. It's for those of you who want to know what my tattoo says, it says it's National Walk Safely to School Day. So it's an important day. I'm sure they worked it out as having some symbolic significance with reconciliation. But I was walking about 25 little kids aged 4 and 5 from a local park to the Kangaroo State School this morning. I felt like Mother Duck. And if you see the photograph, I think it's on my website, it looks a bit like a scene from Abbey Road. It's crossing the crossing, me at the head and all these possums behind me. That's a long way of explaining why I got a tattoo. And the third, of course, is to be invited here to speak at this opening of Reconciliation Week here in Queensland. I think at a time like this, it's worth reflecting on one core fact, and that is that progress is possible. There are many in our national Australian family who think that it's not, and have argued for a long, long time that it could never be. And it's easy to get suckered into that. For those of you who have been in this movement for a long, long time, and I see some battle-wearied faces around the room, bright, effervescent, but nonetheless battle-weary. There must have been times in recent decades where you felt it was just all too hard, all too impossible, all too difficult. For example, on this question of reconciliation between the first Australians and those of us who came much later. And certainly as a kid growing up in rural Queensland, not far from here, about 100 kilometres up the road, and having grown up with the natural and endemic racism of rural Queensland in the 1960s as a kid. And to reflect on where we'd got to as, by the time I was a young adult, and listening to Bjorka Peterson and his then state ministers for Aboriginal and Islander affairs, people like Ken Tompkins and others. And of course, various famous state bureaucrats who worked in this field as well, in their various proclamations over time. It was only 20 or 25 years ago that racism was deep and entrenched. Deep and entrenched. I remember a guy called Ken Tompkins. Any of you remember Ken? He was Aboriginal Affairs Minister under Joe back in the early to mid-80s. That's not that long ago, that's 25 years plus. I was a young Australian diplomat at the time, and we were joined by a series of young diplomatic trainees from various other countries in Asia, Africa and the Caribbean, who came to study with us for 6 months on how to become a diplomat. It's part of our development assistance program with many emerging countries. And part of that program had us take these young diplomats from Uganda, from Zimbabwe, from Barbados, from Jamaica, from Grenada, from the Philippines, from Indonesia, from Bangladesh, from Pakistan, from India, and to travel the country, show them something of Australia. My job was to organise the program here in Brisbane, and to organise a program with Joe and the state government ministers. And we left it to their discretion as to who they would provide as their speaker. This was in 1981, 82, 83, sometime around there. And Joe couldn't attend, but he sent Ken along to speak instead. Ken, I think, was from out west somewhere, I can't remember exactly where. And there we sat in front of him, bright young diplomats from Africa, bright young diplomats from Asia, bright young diplomats from the Caribbean, and a bunch of us Anglo-Celtic Australians as well. And Ken warmed to his topic, and he said, he looked at the audience, and he saw that some people were black. And Ken, in the enormous sensitive tradition of the Queensland National Party, then observed, "We've got blacks here too." He said, "And I've always got on well with blacks. In fact, out on my property out there in Western Queensland, we've got really good black fellas. Some of them are my best mates. And the great thing about our black fellas is they don't give us any back chat." And I sat there and cringed and died on the inside when that was said, not just to a bunch of us Anglos, but frankly to young diplomats from all around the world. That was Queensland, less than 30 years ago. And the reason I put that forward, as someone who's much younger in this movement than many of the battle-scarred ones among us here today, is it is of itself a demonstration of the fact that progress is possible, that real progress is possible, that things are not forever frozen in time, that it is possible to re-engineer people's outlook and their attitudes. As someone said to me today, at the point at which you get to the stage where someone in the room begins to frown when a racist joke is told, or a joke about the gay community is told, at the point at which someone in the room begins to frown and then begins to speak up, then the parameters of that which is acceptable begin to change. From little things, big things grow. Which brings me to the subject of reconciliation, the apology, closing the gap, and constitutional recognition. On the question of the apology, much has been said, much has been written. I'll just say one thing tonight about it. I have not the faintest idea whether it would work. Not the faintest idea. I knew I had to do one thing right, and that was make it authentic from me as an individual. I had no idea how the great unwashed out there in the greater Australian Anglo-Celtic community would respond, and I had absolutely no idea how Indigenous Australians would respond. You might have got applauded by one and smashed by the other. I had no idea. And I remember walking in there with Therese that morning saying, bugger me, I wonder how this is going to turn out. The miracle of the apology had nothing to do with the words that were spoken by me and the words that were written in my own hand. The miracle of the apology was that those of you who are Indigenous Australians with us here this evening, and your brothers and sisters across the country, accepted the apology. That's the miracle of the apology. Because it was entirely in your rights to say, sounds great, Kevin, go jump in the lake. Because we've been putting up with this for a couple of 100 years. Here's another bunch of pearly phrases. Thank you very much, get lost. And if you reflected for a moment on the contents of the Bringing Them Home report and what it had to say about the sheer indignity to which we, white Australians, inflicted upon our Aboriginal brothers and sisters, it would have been perfectly within their rights to tell us to go jump in the lake. So the true miracle of the apology is that Indigenous Australians accepted it. And that says something extraordinarily strong about the Indigenous peoples of this vast land we call Australia, for which I thank you. The apology is step one. Step two, you've heard me speak on this before, is closing the gap. As I said in the apology, unless words are accompanied by actions, then it is but a sounding cymbal and a clanging gong, paraphrasing St. Paul in his letter to the Corinthians quite some time ago. And that's what closing the gap is all about. I won't go through the details now, but I simply advance to you another proposition. Progress is also possible in closing the gap. Those who think that it's all too hard, that we'll never change the gap in life expectancy, never change the gap in education outcome, never change the gap in health outcome, never change the opportunities for employment or housing, frankly, you're just captured by historical thinking. And if you do that, you're condemned to this view that history is somehow determinist, that racism is the norm and it's all just gonna fizzle out. I submit to you the reverse proposition, which is that if we set our minds and hearts to things, we can change things fundamentally. But to keep us white fellas honest, one thing I'm particularly proud of in the apology is this. And it was a thought that came to my mind about 5 minutes before walking in to give the apology. And I wrote it in, which was, every anniversary on the apology, the Prime Minister of the day shall deliver a national report card to the Parliament on how this country has progressed or regressed against any of the closing the gap measures which are articulated in the apology. That's to keep us all honest, but also to give us hope and encouragement that progress is real. Let me give you one example. We promised back then that we'd have all Indigenous 4-year-olds with an opportunity given to them for preschool education with literacy and numeracy, teachers, to close that particular gap so that we weren't perpetuating another generation of Aboriginal educational disadvantage and then employment disadvantage. Well, we've done that. It's a massive effort, particularly in the remote communities, but let me tell you, we've done that. Some of the others are less flash in their outcome. But the whole point is to keep us all honest to the task we have set. A national apology, a national strategy for closing the gap to which all these governments, state and federal, were signed up to by intergovernmental agreement, which I signed in Darwin at the end of 2009. And we come to the third step, which was just alluded to, which is constitutional recognition. This is something I committed an incoming Labor government to doing when I was elected at the end of 2007. It's 5 years on, you know. We haven't got there yet. It's time we did it. It's time, it's high time we did it. I believe the mood of the nation is such that the nation wants to do it as well. There are debates and internal debates about final forms of phraseology and how it's to be couched, etc. I'm respectful of those differences of opinion, but we could have had a year-long debate about the parsing of each phrase of the apology as well, rather than just me writing in the study at the lodge, where I chose basically to ignore all bureaucrats and just went off and spoke with one Aboriginal elder. It's time for us as a parliament, representing the people of Australia, to enact this apology, enact this constitutional recognition of the first Australians. If we push this off, I believe we are in a grave danger of not seizing the moment. This is not just symbolism, it is substance. But the symbolism is there for us and for the world to see that this was not terra nullius, as the High Court found in relation to the Mabo matter, that this was a country occupied by a proud people for tens of thousands of years before any of us of a paler pigmentation came in sailing ships to settle on these shores and to occupy this land and to take it from the first Australians. Entrenching that as a constitutional reality is necessary. Let us not put it off and off and off. Let us not make it subject to the arcane politics that is transacted day to day in our nation's capital, Canberra, in what occasionally passes for a considered national discussion and debate. It's just time to do it, frankly. And the time to do it is now. Which brings me to my last point about progress. I reflected on things changing in Queensland. I reflected on things changing across our nation with the apology, with closing the gap, and prospectively, I hope, with an act of constitutional recognition. But there's also the possibility of real progress the world over. My good friend Jackie Huggins is here with us this evening. A year or so ago, or maybe it's less than a year, is it, Jackie? Feels like an eternity. I've been through several career adjustments since then. It was a joke, by the way. We were at a conference in Co in Switzerland, organised by the Initiatives of Change. It's a pretty interesting mob, the Initiatives of Change. Anyone here heard of them? They were set up by a bunch of Christian churches straight after the war. In fact, they had their antecedents prior to the war. Their one mission was, given the ashes of World War II, how did you reconcile the people of France with the people of Germany? You know, given that they'd been slaughtering each other on and off, really, since the Napoleonic Wars. You had the Napoleonic Wars, massive French invasions of then Prussia and the other German states, followed by the Franco-Prussian War, whereby the Prussians then caused the capitulation of France, followed by the First World War and the carnage on the Western Front, followed by the Second World War. This had not been a good season. And so this bunch of Christians sit down at a conference centre in Co, which is like this grand end of 19th century, fin de siècle grand hotel looking down on Lake Geneva, which was used for the repatriation of Jewish refugees from the camps straight after the war. And so these folk got together and they decided, what can we do to fix it between the French and the Germans? Quite a noble aspiration when you think about it. It's a bit like some crazy person here coming up with an idea 30 or 40 years ago. How can we fix it between white Australians and Indigenous Australians? Given that we white Australians had tried to annihilate black Australians. It's the truth of it. It's the truth of it, even if most people don't have the guts to admit the reality. And so these guys set up the Initiatives of Change, and they then brought hundreds of young Germans and hundreds of young French, including their political leaders over time, starting in 1946, to meet and to discuss their future together. The whole concept of the European community and the European Union, it is well established now as an historical and diplomatic fact, came out of the early meetings in Co between the post-war French leaders and the post-war German leaders. Konrad Adenauer and Schuman, the then Socialist Prime Minister of France. They met there, they talked, they discussed, and they worked it out, how they could possibly bring about an agreement which would cause war between these two peoples never to occur again. And in France today and Germany today, such a possibility is now unthinkable. For most of the last 500 years, it's not been only thinkable, it used to happen every other week. Why I say all that is because when Jackie and I were there as the guests of this mob not long ago, and given its history, they asked us to speak about reconciliation between settler communities and Indigenous communities. Do you know how many Indigenous communities, Indigenous peoples there are around the world today? 350 million. If you take communities of Latin America, those who are called and often described as American Indians or Incas, or as people who came from the ancient civilizations of the Mayans, and Indigenous communities everywhere across Asia and across Africa. And those have been displaced by settler communities, usually white. Not always, but usually white. So here is the next challenge of progress once we tidy up our national books here in Australia. Because progress is possible, we've seen it. Is to actually take this concrete message of reconciliation to the Indigenous peoples of the world with a progressive hope which says, we can do this. If you've been thrown off your land in the back blocks of Chile and Peru and Argentina and Brazil, there is hope. If you've been thrown off your land as a bunch of people who are stateless in the border regions between Burma and Thailand, the Rihongo, then there is progressive hope. So I think in this country of ours, Australia, where fortunately now we come from everywhere, as I see from the faces represented around this room this evening, we have within our grasp the possibility not just to complete our own task within Australia, but to take the progressive message of reconciliation to the world. And that, I believe, is something which we can all look forward to. And the surprising thing I say to all of you here is the world looks at us as an emerging example of hope on this score. We might be full of gloom, doom and despair about our national circumstances, such as the Australian condition. Politicians and politics is all buggered and broken according to every newspaper you read. The world actually sees it a bit differently to that. And on this question, I actually see us have made not perfect, but measurable progress. I think, therefore, we have a responsibility to rise to this next task. Complete the reconciliation job ahead of us, and then to sustain it in our daily lives as Australians into the future, complete our task of constitutional recognition, and be agents of hope and change in what is a difficult and painful world. Thank you for your attention.